And so today is also 2 days before February 4th, which is the anniversary of the Philippine-American War, which started 126 years ago, after the Philippines was annexed from Spain to the US as a colony. So during this war between the Filipino people and the US government, over 1 million Filipinos were massacred or died from diseases in this, act of conquest by the US. So it really marked the start of US colonization in the Philippines. And as we'll hear about during this webinar, how, this legacy of colonization really continues on into to the present day. And so we hope to, throughout this webinar to communicate the history of how the US government has really intertwined itself into all aspects of Philippine society, and talk about the real impacts that it has on the Filipino people and land. But um, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Jordan to get into some calls to action before we get into the meat of the program.
Yeah, thanks, Brittany. So throughout this entire webinar, you can refer to this link, byanusa.org/USOut, to understand more deeply what our calls and demands are for the campaign. But today we'll also be going a little bit more in depth about what we're asking for you all, in addition to just endorsing the campaign. Because this is an anniversary, a very significant anniversary, like what Brittany was just mentioning, we are calling for a week of action starting from today through the 8th to hold US out of the Philippines activities, whether it is a direct action, a study, or some kind of gathering this week. And there are already some actions being planned in different regions, which we'll share about at the end. But we also hope that you will be able to endorse the campaign by the end of our webinar, if not right now, um, to really join us in sharing these updates and calls to actions with your own communities, your own organizations, and your own network. We have different opportunities for people to become volunteers for the campaign itself, to join a committee, whether it's based on research or the production of public materials like our website or other informational publications. And we also, of course, as a grassroots organization, do rely on the people for our donations to our campaign efforts. So this link, which we can send in the chat as well, has all of those options for you to get plugged into our US Out of the Philippines campaign. And with that, we'll go to the meat of our webinar. I'll pass it to Ari, Richard, and Andan.
Everyone, I'm Richard. Working with AB Seattle. I'm like Bayan Seattle. That's part of Bayan, Washington.
And hi everyone, my name is Ari, and I'm with Bayan UW, University of Washington.
And this is Andan with Bayan USA.
So we'll be facilitating today. Today's presentation is really just a primer of the US Out campaign and the basis for why we're waging it. Today we'll cover the stats on Filipinos in the US military, history, economic relations, counterinsurgency, impacts on the Filipino people, and then we'll close with a recap and discussion Q&A on what questions do people have, what are some ways that we can all take up this campaign in our communities. But first, wanted to see the pulse in the room. How are we all impacted or connected to US military? And of course, the only possible way we can do that is through bingo. Next slide. Okay, so just given time, we're not going to go through all of these different aspects, but I'll just read the first two rows and feel free to jot down on a piece of paper next to you if you get bingo, but we'll collectively see just on this who on this call or through this call, we're going to see if we collectively get bingo. So first question or statement. I know someone who got citizenship through the military. Feel free to put in the chat if that's you or someone you know. Emoji reacts. Anyone? Okay, I know a Filipino in the US military. Oh, okay. Another. I know someone impacted by Trump's potential mass deportations. Yes, all of us. My parents migrated to the US. Wait, my level, not my parents. Oh my God. I am Phil Am and was not taught to speak Filipino. Wow, okay. Looks like we already got bingo. We'll read through the second line. Anyway, I was born in the US. I know a Filipino who needed to join ROTC to afford college. More people. I know someone that was deployed to the Philippines. I speak one of the over 100 languages of the Philippines. And we'll just end with this next one. I know a Filipino who used to be in the US military. Wow. Okay, thank you everyone for helping us see what are some of the ways our lives have been affected by the US military. And it's unfortunate that we just got bingo on this, but let's also, through this campaign, make sure we never get bingo again. And with that, I'll pass it off to Andan.
Cool. Thanks, Richard. So, when hopefully you can do this primer with others in your cities, you can actually play the full bingo game, right? But we wanted to get this started with some fast facts to get our brains racing a little bit. And I just wanted to present three facts here before we get into the real content, just as background for the campaign, no? One is that the Asia Pacific region, of course, that's where the Philippines is where 40% of the global population resides, and it's also the world's largest market for US exports. Number two, the Philippines is the largest recipient of US military assistance in the Asia Pacific region. And third is that the presence of US military on Philippine soil is actually a violation of the Philippine Constitution since the 1987 Constitution was ratified. So, how do these three different facts interplay with each other? What does that mean for our campaign? These are some of the things that we want us to all be reflecting on and hopefully be able to answer in terms of why these are some motivations for us to be waging this campaign in the first place. So I'll pass it back to Richard to talk about some other stats.
Thank you. So just want us to keep maybe this question in mind. How did we get here? Keep that in mind as I go through some of the facts of Filipinos in the US military. So of the countries that supported the US during World War II, the Philippines was one of them. And actually, we had over 250,000 to 400,000 Filipinos serving in the US military at the time. Of the countries that supported the US, the Philippines was the only country that didn't receive military benefits from the US. So just keep in mind, think about why, and we'll get into that later. Since 2016, 82% or 417,000 of immigrant veterans were naturalized citizens, with the top two countries coming from Mexico and the Philippines at 68,000. And actually, since 2022, this has since increased to over 84,000. So we can see from some of these stats that actually many of us, and actually from bingo earlier, many Filipinos have joined the US military to get citizenship. And Filipino nationals have actually been able to join the Navy, for instance, since 1901. And since then, there have been 35,000 Filipinos active duty in the Navy. More specifically and recently, just last year, 10.7% of Filipinos gain citizenship through the US military. And the majority of these are actually youth, so between ages 19 to 35, which added up to over 33,000 people. And then through the years since COVID, the COVID pandemic, the number of Filipinos gaining citizenship through enlistment has actually increased pretty steadily from 460 in 2020 to 1,650 in 2024. So if a majority of these people gaining citizenship are youth, we can also see the role that ROTC plays in recruiting youth. You may see ROTC, junior ROTC in your high schools, at colleges, but this is one of the ways that the U.S. military preys on youth who maybe are seeking citizenship or can't afford college. And as of 2024, there are 15,000 Filipinos in active duty in the U.S. Navy, with, of course, many others in other branches of the U.S. military. And so all of these stats are actually just who is formally part of the U.S. military. We also know that the U.S. trains the armed forces of the Philippines and supplies the armed forces with weapons. So there are many ways that we'll get into later as well that the U.S. Militarizes our communities, both here and in the Philippines. To recap, I know that was a lot of different facts, but we've collectively learned some of the roles that the U.S. and U.S. military have played in our families, and then some of the statistics. I threw a lot of numbers at you, no need to memorize them all. But let's dig a little deeper into why this is the case and what's the current status of U.S. presence in the Philippines. And I'll pass to Ari.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think you posed a really good question of how we got here, and even want to pose the question of how the U.S. got to the Philippines. And so if we look at this timeline, it's very high surface for now, but really notable points where we see a history of colonization, both direct and now indirect U.S. colonial rule for over a century. And it all really starts at the turn of the century in 1898, when the U.S. was beginning to expand its reach beyond its borders as a rising imperialist power and had bought the Philippines. Of course, this doesn't go without our people's resistance with the U.S.-Philippine War. Just decades later, in 1946, the U.S. had given the Philippines nominal independence, meaning on paper, we understand it as an independent country, but we really see in practice the semi-colonial nature of the Philippines. And under this puppet rule, as Richard was saying, the U.S. had developed both the Philippine National Police and the Armed Forces of the Philippines, or the AFP, that continues to train and supply these forces both through unequal military agreements like the Visiting Forces Agreement in 1999, as well as the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, in 2014. And we can dig more deeply into those in the next slide. Yeah, so since the 1890s, the US bases began to really pop up following the colonial handoff, starting with Cavite Yard, which is a naval base. And we understand how these bases were really used for US wars of aggression all around the world. And just a century later, in 1992, we see the National Democratic Alliance, Bayan, which was just formed years prior, a democratic expression of the Filipino people, really applying pressure on the government to remove the US military presence, which was victorious, but just for a bit, because although it had removed military bases, it didn't replace the puppet government. And so over time, the US continues to insert itself economically, politically, culturally through various tactics, including two unequal military agreements, such as the Visiting Forces Agreement which was signed in 1999, and it had authorized the permanent stay of US soldiers in the Philippines under the cover of nonstop joint military exercises and the rotation of military troops. But this has no duration, and US forces can deploy or station an unlimited number of troops anywhere in the Philippines for any unspecified activity. So, just in essence, this is the US's scheme of bringing back its troops. And then we see in the next slide, 10 or so years ago, EDCA was ratified, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, part of the American-Philippine Alliance, which allowed the US to rebuild its military bases in the Philippines. And just 2 years ago, in 2023, Marcos approved 4 new EDCA sites. So we have a total of 9 that are all strategically spread throughout the archipelago. And this is really significant because around this time, under Obama and Noynoy Aquino, U.S. is declaring its pivot to Asia, the primary front of U.S.-led war against China. And we're going to get into the impacts later, but we really understand how the Philippines and the Filipino people are really put in the crossfire. So EDCA, in essence, is bringing back the the physical bases. And so now, under Trump, the returning Trump administration, ever since he was elected, his administration has made it really clear that it will maintain its current unequal military policy over the Philippines. Just within the first week of his inauguration, high-level officials from both governments, including secretaries for defense, security, and foreign affairs, they all met in quick succession to cement this relationship. And we can only really expect US militarization over the Philippines to intensify now that Trump and Marcos are in power. And I think there's so many more unequal military agreements that we can really look into and understand. But we should also look beyond and understand how the US has its hands economically, which Andan will walk us through.
Thanks. So that was a really great overview of the history of militarism. But one question that we should pose to ourselves is why, right? There is a reason why the US has had such a vested interest in maintaining its military occupation of our country. And that's simple, right? It wants to also protect its hold over the Philippines' natural resources, its access to our market, and access to cheap labor, cheap Filipino labor. And so when you look at the sum total of it, US military intervention also serves US economic plunder. So when we say US out of the Philippines, it's not just about the military itself, but also US corporations, capital that are actively stealing resources from our land, that are actively committing, labor rights violations and so on. And so instead of helping the Philippines create a more self-reliant economy where there's sustainable jobs for people, the US works alongside the very rich in the Philippines to keep the Philippine economy not in favor of the poorest of the poor, right? The workers, farmers, and so on. And that keeps the Philippines and the Filipino people in debt. It keeps them reliant on imports, and it keeps the economy reliant on exporting whatever is produced in the Philippines. That's why we call the Philippines export-oriented and import-dependent. So, in addition to the unequal military agreements that folks mentioned earlier, there have also been a lot of unequal economic agreements. Some of these are, industry specific, like the Mining Act of 1995. And under that act, just as one provision there, foreign mining corporations don't have to pay taxes and they can actually own everything that they extract from the ground. The Philippines doesn't have to get any of it, right, for a certain period of time. Just last year, there also passed a nuclear energy agreement called the 123 nuclear agreement, and that is bringing in US-based nuclear energy corporations to set up untested reactors in the country, right? So to further profit from um, uh, land there and business. And these things are especially important to note today because the economic and military stranglehold over the Philippines is in the context of the US is trying to maintain its dominance in the Asia Pacific region, but more and more is being challenged by China, right? And so that intense militarization of the Philippines by the US, of Korea, of Okinawa, of the entire Asia Pacific region is really meant to contain China's economic power too. And so on the images that you can see here, you'll see on the bottom right what's called island chains. And this is part of the United States economic or military strategy to encircle and contain China, that it creates these chains of bases through, again, Okinawa, the Philippines, South Korea, and so on. And it has one layer and then a second layer, right, through Guam. And if we relate this to the economic side of things too, the top right shows the semiconductor business, right? Semiconductors is a crucial industry because it's what powers basically everything, right? From uh, electronics, cars, you name it, right? And if you look at which countries have big markets for semiconductors, it's the ones that are along this first island chain as well. And so you can really clearly see the ties between the United States' economic interests and how it defends that through its military, right? Next slide. And so this intentional, right? We call it intentional underdevelopment and plunder of the Philippines by the United States. It keeps the people poor, especially the workers, especially the peasant farmers. But for us here in the United States and abroad, it also has a direct impact, right? Rather than creating genuine industry, regular jobs, living wages, the Philippine government instead has created a system of labor export so that instead of having jobs in the country, it promotes jobs abroad, right? And that allows it to keep the Philippine economy afloat through remittances. I'm sure many of our families remit a lot of money, are working two, three, four jobs just to continue supporting our families' education, rent, food on the table back home. And that puts us and our families abroad in a very hard situation, right? Where we're faced with a lot of um, uh, economic hardship, right? Many people are also forced to be in vulnerable status here, right? Because there's no livelihood back home and they'll take whatever they can get here in the United States despite the danger. And so uh, the number one export really of the Philippines are its people, right? Over 7,500 Filipinos are being forced to migrate every day in search of livelihood. And this is the other impact of US militarism in our homeland. And so we've seen how the United States intervenes militarily, economically, but this intervention doesn't always just look like US boots or US corporations on the ground. And the next section will dive deeper into another phase of US intervention in the country. And so I'll pass it back to Richard to talk about counterinsurgency.
Thank you. So a question for us during this section is, why is there counterinsurgency? How does it look? What are the different ways it manifests? You can put your guesses in the chat, but I'll just take us through. So the US military has actually used the Philippine military in order to maintain the illusion of independence. So we learned earlier that the Philippines gained nominal independence from the US, but in reality, the US really controls through all the different methods, culturally, economically, militarily. And of course, this wouldn't be possible without the subservience of the Philippine government and the armed forces serving whomever pays them the most, which is currently the US. In fact, every Philippine president serving as a mouthpiece to the US's economic and military interests has had counterinsurgency programs aiming to crush people's resistance against US's dominance in the area, the landlord's ruling class control of the government, using the government for personal profit, and the resistance against feudalism. The counterinsurgency is really being used to crush those fighting for genuine solutions like national industrialization, genuine land reform, things that would actually lead to the Philippines becoming sovereign and democratic. But the good news is that every counterinsurgency program has failed because they're not actually addressing the reasons there is armed resistance. So for 13 decades, US-based counterinsurgency programs have been present, or counterinsurgency supported programs, with the goal of conquering land, exporting labor, pacifying revolutionaries. And they've been met with well-organized, a revolutionary movement for self-determination. So we're seeing throughout Philippine history that where there is repression, we've also met it with resistance. Counterinsurgency's strategic objective is to maintain the Philippines as a neo-colony, a source for cheap raw materials, and as a highly exploitable labor force, as we learned earlier, all in order to prop up the US monopoly capital through a US puppet regime. And we can tie this strategy back to the Phil-Am War that we also learned the anniversary is coming up on the 4th. Counterinsurgency today continues under Bongbong Marcos. He's continuing the whole of nation approach, Executive Order 70, the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, that was passed under Duterte. He's really using the fact that the Philippines is the largest recipient of US military assistance in the Asia-Pacific region to keep himself in power and to serve US interests. The US has delivered more than $1 billion in military aid, equipment, and training to the Philippines. Recently, I think it was last year, the US gave an additional $500 million to the Philippines, and there's currently a push for the US to give another $500 million for the next 5 years over each year. So that would be $1.5 billion to the Philippines. So what is Marcos using this money for? What is he using the Filipino people's money for? Our tax dollars for Filipinos abroad. What is that going towards? Marcos is really dumping all of this into the military and counterinsurgency efforts, especially through the NTF-LCAC that I mentioned earlier, which has led to over 3.7 million cases of harassment and intimidation just under his presidency alone, and nearly 47,000 cases of indiscriminate bombings of the Filipino people by the armed forces of the Philippines. We can see specific examples of this in the countryside, which is where a majority of Filipinos live, through a form of called hamletting, which is where the military moves throughout and occupies entire villages in the countryside. Essentially, Marcos is enacting de facto martial law across the country. And then just last year, as we saw in the trailer earlier, Bayan conducted a peace mission. And I'll pass to Andan to share a little bit about what we saw there.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So for those who are logged on to see the video trailer in the beginning of the session, if not, we can link the YouTube video, the YouTube link in the chat. Some of the most direct impacts of US-backed counterinsurgency in the Philippines have been in the city of Marawi. And Marawi is a city in Mindanao that was sieged for several months, backed by, the US military, because of a supposed counterterrorism operation. What ended up happening is that the entire city was displaced, hundreds of thousands of people. And up until this day, there are so many who have not been able to return back to their homes. They live in quote unquote temporary resettlement camps where now some of them are even having to pay for electricity, having to pay for rent. The sanitation systems are in shambles. They don't have any access to livelihood opportunities. And there's a lot of bureaucratic red tape for them to be able to gain compensation for what happened to them to rebuild their homes and rebuild their lives. And these are really the direct impacts of US-backed counterinsurgency and US militarism in the homeland. The communities that we interviewed talked about, seeing US soldiers, seeing US warplanes, knowing that the bombs dropped on their city were funded by the US, provided by the State of Israel and many other nations. And it's the people that lost out in the end. So these are all things that have real ongoing lasting impacts on the people.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, if we can go back one more slide, just to wrap up this section. So we saw some of the impacts of counterinsurgency in the countryside, in Marawi. Wanted to also highlight what that can look like in the cities. What does increased militarism of in the cities look like? In the top right corner of the slide, wanted to highlight Mark Chua, who was in 2001, he exposed corruption within the ROTC program at his school and wrote an expose on it. Shortly after, he was found dead. So this is another example of how the Marcos government is militarizing not just the countryside, but also the cities. And there is active repression of those that are willing and forced to speak out and resist what's happening. We can also expect, as we learned earlier, that with Trump in power, there will continue to be active participation and cooperation between the Philippines and the US state in the coming years. So to recap this section on counterinsurgency, we just learned that US-backed counterinsurgency aims to keep the Philippines subservient to its economic and strategic interests, to maintain the semi-feudal system, and to continue the exploitation of our people. And at the same time, we know there has and continues to be resistance, those willing to take up all forms of struggle, fighting for genuine solutions. And with that, I'll pass it to Ari to cover some of the day-to-day experiences of Filipinos.
Yeah, that's good. Definitely seeing the counterinsurgency as also part of the day-to-day experiences too. And we've already really been talking about it. So I think before going into this, wanna maybe give a little bit of a trigger warning for more, I think, more on violence, how our Bayan are experiencing sexual violence and even murder. But yeah, can get into the impacts of the Filipino people and land. If we go into the next slide. And these are just, I think, some of so many more that we can continue to talk about today and after we hop off of this webinar with our orgs, with our people. But I guess also just to recap some that Andan and Richard have shared, the forced family separation and the forced migration of our people we understand it will become even more rampant under heightening militarism, as well as we understand the correlation that high levels of militarization has on increasing violence against women by foreign troops that result in sexual abuse, rape, forced prostitution. I think we maybe know the life and also the murder of Jennifer Lade really well, who was a trans Filipina murdered by a US Marine, Joseph Scott Pemberton, back in 2014, who was imprisoned because of the people's outcry, but under the visiting forces agreement, actually, was given special treatment and was imprisoned separately from other prisoners. And just 6 years later, in 2020, he was later pardoned and released by Rodrigo Duterte. I think we can also look to the impacts that specific communities like peasants and fisherfolk have on their livelihood. There are specific reports that come out where when the US comes and holds its military exercises in different regions, towns are essentially shut down. There are sail bans for fisher folks who are thus not able to get their daily catch, which is their livelihood. I think also really thinking back to the bingo exercise that we did together. So many of our families join the military and are impacted on the day to day. They join because of economic reasons for citizenship, and the impacts that the military has on those families can really see the strain on family relations and even our people's mental health. To look at the land, maybe just some specific examples. Back in October of 2012, it was discovered that a private military contractor had dumped toxic waste and chemicals from US ships in Philippine waters in Subic. Just from one ship alone, 4 million liters of sewage were collected and dumped in the waters. And then we also see Marcos's 123 nuclear deal with Ultrasafe, which is actually based here with us in Seattle, as well as other companies, will continue to compromise the safety, the rights, and the sovereignty of the Filipino people. It really leads the Philippines to become more dependent on the US for fuel and reactor maintenance. So just some of many examples that we can look into and continue to discuss. But I think really just want to underscore the really devastating and the deadly impacts that US militarism, with the support of Bongbong Marcos, or historically any Filipino president and government, has on the Philippines and our kababayan. But we know that through studying our people's history today and every day, that hope for genuine change really lies with us and the rest of the people. The struggle for land and livelihood is a hard fight that our people are fighting for painstakingly every day, and are really calling for us to join in as Filipinos overseas with our allies here as well to take up the fight for national and social liberation through the waging of US out. And with that, I think I'll pass back to Andan to close us out.
Great. Next slide, please. So in the last 30 minutes or so, we went through a lot, right? The history of US colonization, continued militarism, the economic plunder that it's tied to, the counterinsurgency that it's tied to, and the very real impacts on the Filipino people, right? And we wanted to present all this info so that we all understand how important it is for us to be waging this campaign here and now, right? So next slide. The US Out of the Philippines campaign of Bayan USA has four main goals, right? Given this context, given this violence, what are we trying to do with this campaign? The first is really to expose and put up a fight, right? To oppose the United States' intensifying militarization of the Philippines and its impacts on the Filipino people. Like Ari mentioned, these are deadly impacts, right? This is a life and death situation for a lot of people, whether by, direct, crossfire or economic strangulation, right? The way that we put up a fight is to build up a mass movement, right? And we really need to build up a mass movement, especially among the Filipino community here from within the belly of the beast, from within the United States, to oppose the ways that this country, the United States, is plunging our homeland back into war. Um, and we also are looking towards our allies to help us, right? So that we can end US militarism and US military support in the Philippines. The third is to fight for something, right? We're against US militarism, but we're also for uh, national democracy. What does that mean? It means that we're for national sovereignty. It means that we're for the democratic rights of the people, right? To live without the fear of poverty, to live without the fear of being separated from their loved ones. And that's the program that Bayan USA and other national democratic organizations are fighting for. So instead of war, we want livelihood. Instead of war, we want land. Instead of war, we want a future that we can call our own, right? And a country that we can call our own. But none of that is possible if the United States still has its hands all over the Philippines and the Filipino people. And the fourth one is that we know that the Philippines is by far not the only country and peoples being subjugated to US militarism and war. We want to help and do our part in building a broad anti-war movement against US militarism, especially in the Asia Pacific, right? Since that's where a lot of our discussion today has centered around, but everywhere around the world, right? And that's why, one of the chants that we'll always say in our actions is from Palestine to the Philippines, stop the US war machine, right? And from Palestine to the Philippines to everywhere in between. That's part of our task right now because the impacts of US war are parallel in many other countries too. Next slide. Today, is the relaunch of the campaign, but that doesn't mean that we haven't been waging this campaign in the past, right? You'll see here some photos throughout the decades. And just to give us a sense of how far we've come in the campaign, right? Ever since our founding of Bayan USA in 2005, we've been campaigning against US militarism and intervention in the Philippines. On our founding, we had the tandem of George Bush and Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. And at that time, uh, Bush and Arroyo called the Philippines the United States' second front on the war on terror. And this was after 9/11, right? And so we're intensely campaigning against US-backed militarism, especially in Mindanao. Folks already mentioned that under President Obama and Noynoy Aquino, there was a pivot to Asia. There was the passing of the EDCA. There's also free trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that we fought fiercely against. And then under Trump's first term and Rodrigo Duterte, we opposed both in Congress and on the streets the sending of those hundreds of millions of aid, military aid, and weapons to the Duterte administration, which it used in its brutal, quote unquote, war on drugs and its brutal counterinsurgency operations against the people. And then last year, 2024, on the 125th anniversary of the start of the Philippine-American War, that year was also the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Visiting Forces Agreement, 10 years of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Bayan USA renewed its US Out of the Philippines campaign. And so we're using this year, 2025, as an opportunity to relaunch this campaign again on the year of the 20th anniversary of Bayan USA, recognizing 20 years of people's struggle from here in the United States against US militarism in our homeland, and again on the anniversary or the eve of the anniversary of the Philippine-American War, and of course in this new context of a second Trump administration. Next slide. And so we have five main calls and demands, right, that we're fighting for in this campaign. And hopefully by now, these will make sense to us. But the first is to end the de facto basing and the permanent troop presence in the Philippines. The second is to end all unequal military agreements that make this happen. The third is to end the joint US-Philippine military war games and other war provocations that, again, are dragging our country into war between superpowers that no one wants. The fourth is to end the US-backed counterinsurgency and to also hold accountable the agents who are responsible for violations against people's rights, especially in the countryside. And the fifth is to cut US security assistance to the Philippines. That's military aid, that's aid that goes to the Philippine police, you name it, right? So five main calls and demands. And you might be wondering, well, how can we help with promoting these? Well, the next slide will let you know. There's a lot of different ways to take action. And again, go to bayanusa.org /US-out if you want to visit our campaign page. But there's really four main ways that we're asking for the public to support. First is by endorsing the campaign, and we'd love individual, but we'd love especially organizational endorsements of our campaign. And what endorsement looks like is just supporting our activities by sharing any updates, sharing any calls to action to your membership and also your network. And we'd love to feature your name or logo on the campaign page if you endorse. A second one is to share what you learned today. Raise awareness by facilitating this campaign paper with your organization, your network, your community. And if you feel not as well versed yet, then just reach out to any of our member organizations of Bayan USA, and we'd be happy to help facilitate this for your community. The third is to become a campaign volunteer. And again, this is to help with things like research, production of public materials to get more of the word out, and then, like Jordan mentioned, donate, right? We are producing a documentary from the Peace Mission that we went on last year, and that plus many other campaign activities, of course, require financial support. So these are four easy ways to take action that we hope everyone on this call will consider signing up using this link to commit to afterwards. So next slide. That is it for the primer. We hope everyone learned something, so I'll pass it back to the MCs for our Q&A.
Thanks, Anton. Yeah, hopefully that was very educational or learned something new through that primer that went over the history between the US and the Philippines, economic relations, the counterinsurgency tactics, and how that really impacts the Filipino people and land. So we're going to open it up now for a short Q&A. Feel free to put questions in the chat, or you can also DM them to jm-bayanusa if you change the chat setting to send it to that person. So maybe we can get started with one question. The first one can be, if the US is out of the Philippines, how will the Philippines defend itself?
I can speak on that first. There's this misconception that the United States is the only way that the Philippines can defend itself against enemies, right? Um, I hope that our presentation today showed that actually in the history of the Filipino people, especially in the last 100 years, it's actually been the United States that has been that main aggressor of the people. From the Philippine-American War, which killed up to 1 million Filipinos, to the violence against women, children, the environment, and so on, to the US-backed counterinsurgency happening in our country. How could we look to the country that has brought on the most violence to our people to be the ones to defend us, right? And the second thing we'd say to that is um, look to the history of the Filipino people ourselves, right? Um, at the end of the 1800s, the Filipino people, we built a revolutionary army, one of the first in the Asia Pacific that was able to drive out and defeat Spain, a superpower in the world at the time, right? And we didn't have any foreign powers to support that. That was us, right? If you look during World War II, our country was occupied by Japanese imperial forces. And again, the Filipino people came together to defend our land, right? Look to the Philippine-American War, right? The Filipino people came together to fight, right? So in the history of the Filipino people, it's ourselves. The most reliable and the most trustworthy force that we have to defend our sovereignty is ourselves, right? And we shouldn't be looking towards other countries to do that for us. And that's the kind of it has a different connotation, I think, in the US when we say words like patriotic or nationalist. But in Tagalog, makabayan, right? Makabayan meaning pro-people, pro-nation. And that's the kind of spirit that we want to make sure that we can cultivate among our people because it's easy to forget how powerful we as a people are if we come together.
Thanks, Andan. How about this next question of what does national phasing look like following this relaunch? What are incremental campaign victories we should be building to?
I can start us off again, and then if other people want to add. Um, One of the biggest focuses of our campaign right now, and thank you all for helping with this current phase, is uh, the awareness raising and the raising of public consciousness because uh, you know, unfortunately, right, the um, sentiment among many Filipinos is that the United States is our friend, right? And the United States is helping to defend us, right, or protect us. And I think that's where some of the maybe sentiments from the first question came from. There's really a lot that we have to do to change public consciousness, to re-educate ourselves about our own history, to expose what's really happening in the Philippines right now and how the US is involved or directly responsible for that. And so one of the most important things that we're doing in this current phase of the campaign is to bring more Filipinos to the fold of the campaign. So that asks for endorsement um, is really especially for many of the other Filipino organizations that are out there across the US, or even people who aren't part of organizations but would like to support as individuals. And so for all the organizations here on this call right now, endorsing would be a huge way, and then helping us to spread the word so that we can little by little change that public consciousness. Um, we'll get into a little bit later the different um, uh, key action points for the campaign that we're expecting in the next few months, especially with military war games coming up. And then, of course, we're constantly studying what's happening under Trump. And Ari mentioned earlier that things are developing at a breakneck pace, right, between the Trump and Marcos administration. So there might be very quick tactical fights that we'll call for to, let's say, block an arms sale or to block military aid or to block another type of agreement that we'll have to be flexible towards. So that's some points that I wanted to share for now.
Thank you, Andan. Um, there's a couple of things in the chat around the peace mission that Bayan USA did last year. Um, sorry, I lost the question. I guess what are future opportunities for traveling to the Philippines and doing peace missions or like trips to learn about what the conditions in the Philippines are?
Yeah, we'll also discuss this in the closing, but we do want to continue these peace missions and delegations to the Philippines to continue spreading the word. And some of the best ways that we want to ensure also the security of the people going is to make sure that we have strong relationships with one another. So especially if you are part of an organization that would like to send delegates on these peace missions, these fact-finding missions to understand more in depth the impact of the US on the Philippines and help expose it, please reach out to us to deepen our relationships together so that we could have your members come on the peace mission with us. But we hope that it would be continuous as an annual. So keep an eye out for this year's.
Thanks, Jordan. Um, How do you expect the Trump presidency to impact the situation? I think Anton spoke to this a little bit, but that was another question we received.
Yeah, I can elaborate a little further on that. Um, very soon after Trump was elected president, um, Marcos and Trump had a call, and that kind of cemented the beginnings of this uh, unholy tandem. Um, there have been a lot of moves, right, between the Trump administration and Marcos, even after inauguration. The day after inauguration, the Department of Foreign Affairs, which is basically the Philippine equivalent of the Secretary of State. So the U.S. Secretary of State, uh, Rubio, met with the DFA head, and they talked. And they talked about the United States' continued commitment to quote unquote peace in the Asia Pacific region, and specifically naming the quote unquote threat of China, right? Literally the day after, the heads of the Department of National Defense in the Philippines and also the National Security Advisor in the Philippines also met with counterparts in the US in person, um, to discuss the very same things, right? Um, Military agreements, security assistance, and then on top of that, also economic deals. So those things happened literally the day after inauguration, and then the day after that. So we really don't see any, strategic shift under a Trump administration in how it will treat the Philippines. If anything, because of how war hawkish, especially against China, the people who are filling Trump's cabinet are, we can only expect those things to get worse, right? And Trump and Marcos have a long history together, if folks aren't familiar, because when Marcos Sr. was ousted, right, and came to the United States, he and his family spent time in New York also, where Trump was. And they would have, Trump was close with Marcos Sr., he was close with Imelda. And so there's also this aspect of that personal relationship that I'm sure will also complicate things. Um, you know, Project 2025 is also very anti, um, I mean, everything, right? It's also very anti like progressive movements fighting for national independence, movements that are anti-capitalist in general. And so, especially for the National Democratic Movement, we can expect that Trump will double down even harder on progressive movements in the Philippines fighting for the US to be out and for sovereignty and democracy to be brought in, right?
Yeah, thanks, Andan. The I think one of the first things in one of the phone calls between Marcos and Trump once he was officially elected was asking, "How's Imelda?" So Trump and the Marcos families are very, very tight. We can expect that Marcos will continue to be a lapdog under Trump, even more so. There is also news about Marcos and Trump having a meeting very soon. So we should also be prepared to have rapid response actions or quick response actions if he comes to the US or when the meeting does happen. They're supposed to talk about Filipino migrants, but we'll definitely discuss everything from economy to the military agreements and trade agreements that have already been put in place as well. So we do need to prepare to protest this gathering of the two most fascist heads of state of the Philippines and the US. So our next question is, if my family is in the military, does that mean they're the enemy? It's a great question. Yeah. Yes, I can answer. The answer is no. Um, no, we don't view, individuals who are forced because of the economic, cultural, political oppression of the Philippines to choose the path of the military as enemies of the Filipino people. It is something, I think one of the other questions here is like, what is the propaganda in the Philippines around the US? And it is just so indoctrinated that the US empire is the way that the Filipino should model its life after. That's where the American dream is so such a pivotal thing that our people chase after. But that does not mean that because a Filipino family member chooses to take up their work or life in the military, that they then are the enemy. The enemy is U.S. empire that is forcing our people to make these choices. We should, as much as possible, educate. That's why this first phase of the campaign is really about education and spreading the word about the actual realities of what the military does to not just the Philippines, but the world, especially under the US. So there's much to do. My dad was also in the military. He's a Navy veteran. I grew up on military bases and thought that that was the norm, right? Many of our members have Filipino family members that also petitioned us here, right? For a better life. And that's often the choice that is made. The military is a path out. But that does not mean that our family members are the ones that we should be fighting. It is the entity of US empire that we should be fighting with them.
Thanks, Jordan. I think we have time for one more question, so I'll go with one that kind of lends into our calls to action. So how can folks best get in touch with y'all to help with research, social media, and other tasks?
Hi, this is Jill from the Bayan USA and National Executive Committee. I think the best way to get involved with the campaign is one, definitely sign up on our campaign website to endorse, but also connect with your local Bayan chapter or national democratic organizations. We have Gabriela, we have Anak Bayan, Migrantes all over the country. And yeah, partner up together, volunteer with the campaign, and really start to make the campaign alive on the ground. We really do need the support of people researching, volunteering, like making pamphlets and newsletters, educational discussions. So after this webinar today, we also hope that you can conduct these educational discussions in your local areas. So if you're not already connected, we'll support in making the connections, and especially if you're not yet in an organization, please join an organization and help us really get people together to fight and get US out of the Philippines.
If you visit the site that Joseph just put in the chat, there's a button or a word that says endorse. And if you click on it, it'll also lead you to a form where you can specifically sign up if you want to volunteer for research or social media or other public information stuff too. So that'll also be the easiest way for us to track.
Thanks, Jill and Andan. Could we go back to the slides? That will conclude the Q&A for now. So I know we've gone over the calls to action a few times now, but that's purposeful. We really want people to take action after this webinar. So as we've been talking about, like your organization can endorse the campaign, that would look like sharing campaign activities, sharing updates and calls to action to your membership and network. The link that was sent in the chat, buynusa.org/US out, has information on what endorsing looks like. Second, raise awareness. So use this campaign primer, which we can give access to in the future. Use this campaign primer with your community, your organization, your network. And as Andan said earlier, feel free to reach out to organizations of Bayan USA if you need support in facilitating these types of conversations. Become a campaign volunteer, helping with research or the production of public materials, really, so we can continue to, share this information about U.S. presence in the Philippines and what that means for the Filipino people. And then lastly, donate. There's a link, tiny URL/donate US out PH, if someone could put that in the chat, to support our grassroots campaign efforts too. And then on the next slide, these are some actions that are currently planned, as well as some other important dates. So as Jordan mentioned earlier, this week, February 2nd through the 8th, is a week of action to align with, the anniversary of the Philippine-American War. So you can hold an action, a study, a gathering this week, making sure to use the hashtag #USOutOfPH. So there are some in California on February 4th and February 7th. There's also one in my area on Saturday, February 8th in Washington, D.C. And then also looking ahead to the future, this is a campaign that will continue on, and we want to be able to have more, weeks of action, days of action. So on the screen are some upcoming dates of important, anniversaries or events that are happening in the Philippines or in the Philippines. And then also stay tuned for updates from the 2025 updates for the 2025 peace mission to the Philippines. So there will be another one this year. And I'll pass it to, oh, sorry, one more slide for me. So if you go to this, if you go to buynusa.org/US out, there's also this toolkit that you can have access to that has the different resources on how to take up this campaign. This website also has information on endorsing the campaign. So I will go ahead and pass it to Jordan to close us out now.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brittany. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us today as we continue our fight to call for US out of the Philippines and US out of everywhere. It really is, central to our fight to have genuine sovereignty from US imperialism in the National Democratic Movement. And so to see so many different organizations and individuals aligned with us in these goals is really meaningful. The role of this campaign specifically in the belly of the beast also is very, very significant. This kind of fight against US empire really does require multi-pronged approaches. And from our history that we went over in this last hour, it is clear that our history of resistance and revolution in the Philippines and with the overseas movement in support of it has led to true and genuine change. But we have to continue the fight in order to complete that revolution, right? To have this campaign relaunch on the eve of the Filipino-American War, on the eve of US empire really sinking its claws into the Philippines in history is intentional. We know that today the Marcos Trump regime will continue to tighten its grip on the Filipino people and oppress it. And that will only breed more and more resistance in our homeland and abroad. So with that, we are so honored to be alongside you all in the campaign and to say, like we do in the National Democratic Movement, makibaka, wag matakot, don't be afraid, dare to struggle. So with that, we would love to also take a picture with everyone. We hope that you endorse the campaign, and really glad to see everyone here. So if you can go off or on cam, we'll also stop the recording, but let's take a picture to show this unity.